Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're joining us from. This is the first Wiser webinar in the Back to the Basics series. We have partnered with SideChannel. I'll let later Brian talk a little bit about SideChannel. Um, Great team, great guys. I'm really happy with this partnership. Back to the basic, I think, is one of the most important things that sometimes, all of us, a little bit forget. So I think it's really good to go back. I usually say sharpen our saw, making sure that we don't forget that the basics are what, builds this foundation. So yeah, let's kick it off. Let's do some introductions. Brian, why don't you start, and then we'll just go around and we'll kick it off.
Thanks, Gabby. Brian Hogley. I'm the founder and managing partner for SideChannel. We're a virtual CISO and advisory services firm. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Igor, you're up.
Sure, thanks for having me on. Igor Vilovich, currently VP of Compliance Strategy at Cumulus and previously CISO at Invensys and Schneider Electric Americas.
Thank you, Igor. Tony.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Tony Faria. I am a CISO and cyber strategist at a company by the name of Consortium Networks, previously global CISO for FM Global for 8.5 years.
And last but not least, Michael.
Hi, Mike Waters. I'm a principal consultant with SideChannel. Spent about 10 years as the CISO for a multinational defense contractor. I'm doing virtual CISO consulting for the last 5 years.
Cool. So let's start with, let me go back a little bit. I've been an entrepreneur most of my career, and I know how much risk it takes to start your own business. I've been working also with a lot of entrepreneurs, and people are taking huge risks starting something new. And what always surprises me is that they take all those risks, those personal risks, whether they quit their job, whether they put money in, and they build this business, which starts to grow. But when it comes to, when I talk to them about cybersecurity, too often I hear I'm too small, I'm not a target. And this is guys, you invest, you took a huge risk. Why let all of that, just go down the drain because of something so small that basically doesn't cost a lot as well? So what do you think? What do you guys think? What is the reason that people are thinking, with that mindset of this won't happen to me? Brian, let's start with you.
Sure, I'll kick it off. This is a great question. I get to jump using my board already. But here's your small business, right? Here's your SMB. Here's your startup company. And everyone looks at it as if it's just them. But the reality is you've got all the bad guys out there try to do bad things. And you're like, I'm too small. Okay. But the reality, and I have seen this, is you have a customer. And the real target is that customer. Now, these organizations are traditionally a lot larger. They have a little bit more funding than you do to secure themselves. So their front door, the ROI for this bad guy is significantly higher. But yours is a lot lower. And if I can piggyback and break into your organization and use you to walk into the actual target, well, that's going to be something. And this happens. This is
all the time.
This is happening, and this understanding here just doesn't seem to be within the view of the SMB. And I think it's a big area that just needs a little bit more education and realization around. But this is a reason that you should consider cybersecurity, because you are protecting your revenue stream right here from that customer, and now multiply that customer by many customers. So to do anything, at least do it to protect your revenue stream.
Do you think maybe, Igor, part of this is because maybe business owners are maybe risk takers and they just, I don't know, I'm just making things up. I'm trying to understand what's the psychology of a business to like overlook this. Well, what's your take on this?
Well, I think you're very right to point out psychology. I think that that's an indistinguishable concept from risk and risk management, because we tend to look at risk as this quantified thing, right? Especially, you want to try to apply actuarial tables, you want to get to a point of precision with it. But in reality, we're talking about risk behavior. So it is psychology, it is human. I mean, I'll give you an example, right? I ride motorcycles. I'm very safe about it. I wear my helmet, I wear my gear as much as I can. In the summer, it gets a little hot, but you try. Folks cross the border into Florida, they cross the border into Texas, they stop, pull over to the side, take off their helmets and stow them in their bags, and then they keep riding. And I always ask them why. They go, oh, it's the freedom. I want to feel the wind in my hair. Like, well, you can also feel concrete in your face, right? And that would be catastrophic. But people have different attitudes towards risk, right? And sometimes they're risk averse, and sometimes they're risk takers, and sometimes they don't acknowledge how much risk they're actually taking on. I think there's this constant dark pool of risk that's underpinning a lot of businesses that they're not aware of. So I think your mission, educating them, informing them, bringing in awareness, at least getting them to recognize that maybe you don't have to get to that level of precision, to a decimal point of accuracy, but you do have to understand, you have to acknowledge risk exists. Cybersecurity represents a significant portion of it, and you got to do something about it.
I think we lost you.
Just the audio.
Let's start there, right? Before we start throwing tools at them, before we start throwing formulas at them, and your loss expectancies, things, SMBs, they just don't have those tools, but they got to have the understanding. So you're absolutely right. You start with psychology.
Gotcha. So by the way, we lost you a little bit. I don't know, something with your audio, but I think we heard that. So if the business, if different people have different risk tolerance, and the company is built of people, right? How do we define risk? Because from one person it can be like, I'm a risk taker. For another person in the company, they may be, risk avert. So how do you define risk to a point where everyone is aligned and actually believes in, solving that risk? Tony, Michael, who wants to take this? Michael?
Let me jump in on that. I think that's a critical point for any size organization, even for really large organizations, because if you have a 5-person company, you can easily discuss the risks to the business, and everybody can be on the same phone call and talk it through. You get to a 500, 5,000, 50,000 person company, you can't have that kind of dialogue. So the people who own the business, partners, the people at the top, they're the only ones who should be allowed to accept risk. And it's your job as a information security professional to ensure they understand the risks of what they want to do. Not to tell them no, but to tell, yes, if you want to do that thing, these are the risks and these are how you can address those risks, so they can make the decision to go forward with it. What you don't want is in a company, you don't want somebody who is not senior accepting risk by, I don't know, sticking a USB drive they found on the ground into their laptop. That user, whatever their role in the organization, is deciding this risk that I'm about to take is okay, when it might not be okay for the people who really own the business and who have the most at stake and are the ones who should be accepting risk or rejecting risk, saying, no, we don't want you to install random USB drives. So risk tolerance is based on the business. And those business decisions about what risks to accept, or what risks to mitigate by putting in technical controls or process controls, those have to be made by the business leaders and communicated to the rest of the organization. So if the CISO or the CEO says we're not going to use random USB drives, they have to tell everybody in the organization. That's why user education and awareness training is so critical. Let everybody know what kind of risks we do accept at this business and what we don't.
Yeah. And how do we define what's acceptable risk? Like risk is a list as long as, like it's huge, right?
Sure.
Where do you start? Where do you now define, what risk we are willing to accept, what risk we're not willing to accept? You know what? Let's start with small businesses because, and I think it's a similar challenge, but different when it's a small business and a big business. How would you, Tony, maybe you take that. It's something we spoke about, before a little bit about, the business decision. So um, maybe shed some light on that part. How do you, yeah, how do you define risk?
Thanks, Gabby. So just building on what Michael's already said, whether it's a small business or a large business, I think having that candid dialogue with business leaders, information owners about what are the most important assets to protect based upon their potential impact of compromise, whether made unavailable, whether disclosed to unauthorized parties, gathering that information, saying, okay, these are the things, because it's impractical and unrealistic to say every single asset, system, application, service, process, data, we're going to protect all equally. Certainly you can try, and I think that's what a lot of small businesses try and do, and they become overwhelmed. So if you can have the candid dialogue with the business leaders that say, what are the things that are going to cause the greatest impact to the organization, negative impact, defining that, and then building your security program, the security awareness, training, education around adequate protection capabilities. I think that's where you need to drive the conversation. And then when you've defined these are the default or minimum expectations, and if you can't currently, whether at the program level or one-off, actually put in the capabilities that you expect, the objectives, then that's where the conversation needs to go to risk acceptance, whether more permanently or temporarily until you can introduce a capability to protect it. So either way, it's about risk acceptance, but before you even define what is it that you're accepting, you need to have a better understanding of what it is that you're trying to protect on behalf of the organization.
One of the things that I do for our own business, we're still a small business. The question that I ask myself is, what will happen if, a bad actor will have the keys to the kingdom for 24 hours? Like, what will happen then? That's for me, how can they take down our business within 24 hours, And that's, at least for me, because again, we also can continuously and invest in cybersecurity forever. But at least I start from there. I start from like, if that piece of our company still exists after 24 hours, we can come back. If that piece goes away, like, we just can't. So, it's those tabletop exercises, I think, that you're talking about, where you talk with business owners and you ask them those questions. I think, what matters a lot. And, Igor, we spoke, I think it was yesterday, and that's something that I like that you mentioned, was about, vision, right? Like cybersecurity vision and defining the problem. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? I think, it really helps with defining risk.
Sure. Well, look, I think there's a big problem. I think there's a strategic problem underpinning a lot of cybersecurity efforts across many spaces. Corporate, small, medium business, SLED. It doesn't really matter. And I think that it's the idea that we've begun to recognize, we've been recognizing security as kind of its own function. It's a separate silo. It's a separate thing that we do. And because we want to be distinct, and we want to be unique, and we want to have our own space, and we want to have our own titles and our own functions and our own budgets, right? Let's talk about the organizational aspects there too, the political aspects. Security has become its own animal, and it's always needed to be a dimension of the business, not a separate function. And so we've been getting kind of, slapped onto a lot of things. We've been the people of no, right? We've been the approving authority. We've tried to insert ourselves into the process. We've been the friction point for a lot of the business functions, as opposed to being an enabling function. And really, to me, that convergence of business and security coming together and really becoming one, where we don't really have, I hate to say it, we have a lot of CISOs on this call, right? And probably, a lot of guests who are also CISOs. But as much as it pains me to say it, but eliminating the CISO function is even an idea. And really converging security, IT, business all together, kind of, the same thing we did for DevSecOps. Really, we're talking about a unified function where security is a dimension of every business function. That's really the nirvana state. That, to me, that is a vision. It doesn't have to be your vision, but certainly is an example of a vision. So when I read a mission statement from a security leader that says, we're going to become a world leading security organization, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to measure that, right? But when you actually say, look, we will integrate security into every process that matters. We're going to map our value chain generating activities. We're going to figure out what matters to our business. We're going to talk to the business about it. You know, a post I did recently that got a lot of feedback was I said, talk to your CFO. Don't talk to the CTO. Don't talk to the CIO. You're already talking to them. It's not about technology, right? Talk about value, talk about money, talk about how your business makes its living, and then protect that, right? It sounds simple, but it's a unifying vision that gives you purpose.
I wanna pull on that thread. Like, one thing I catch a lot of heat for is like I genuinely believe there really is no such thing as cybersecurity. It all comes down to good engineering and architecture. But the reality is we don't do that, so we have cybersecurity. Now, the role of the CISO has to exist to kind of uphold that. And like, I agree with you, Igor, like that should be pushed into the organization, the business organizations. But back to tying kind of back into what Michael and Tony were talking about, and I get the draw again, but like, where do you start? Like if everyone on this call could leave today being like, oh, I can go do this exercise and figure this out. And Igor, you hit on it. Every organization is in business to make money, right? If we take a look at how does our organization make money, right? What is the process that is supported that helps us make money? What is the widget, the tool, the service, whatever that is, okay? We can identify what that is for our organization, right? That's a revenue stream. Now, where do you protect? Where do you put security practices into place and then govern them strongly? I would start with, what's your biggest moneymaker in your organization? And now take that, okay? It's this line, it's this customer, whatever it is. Back into, okay, what enables that to happen? Now, once you've identified what enables that money making, there's probably a set of systems, there's probably a set of people, and there's a set of processes that support that and then that revenue. That is where you should start, right? Again, if we can't protect everything in the organization, start with that first moneymaker. What is enabling it? And then what are the things that support that? Now with people, it's actually pretty easy. It should be obviously all admins because they've got the keys to the kingdom, but then it's also key people that are within this. What are the systems? If it's AWS, GCP, if it's cloud, it's on-prem, doesn't matter. And then what are the processes from an integrity standpoint? Are they operating the way that they need to? So again, if you can walk away from today with, hey, I can do this exercise, start with your moneymaker, walk away through, and then guess what? What's your second moneymaker? And repeat. And then your third. Now you've got an idea of where to go start putting security dollars to protect, because you're now protecting the things that matter the most to your organization. And this is what the CEO, the CFO will understand. You can translate and say, this is why we're spending this, because this thing makes us $1 million a day. We're not protecting that one over there because it makes us $1 million a year. And that becomes a very easy business discussion to then have with leadership about, why do we need to fund this? And they will understand that in the context of risk.
You know what I love about what you all guys are saying is you're talking about enabling. And I think, because there's two sides to the coin, right? Like I usually give this example of like, why they invented the car brakes. It's not for stopping, it's for going fast. Like who in his right mind will drive fast without brakes? Car brakes are enablers for going fast. Cybersecurity is the same thing. We are enabling the company to grow fast without crashing. So it's really about where is the growth and connecting those things, right? We connect them, the business goals, the business mission with what we're doing, and then we're, a whole. We're not like a silo that is policing the, everyone else. So here is another question. Anyone can take it. Can you solve risk with a product? Anybody wants to take this?
So I'll take a quick detour on that. Look, I represent a vendor. Cumulus is a security solutions vendor, so I'll acknowledge that right up front. Having said that, Our idea is to traffic in ideas first, traffic in concepts first, before we try to traffic in products, right? And I think understanding where you fit in the stack is important. More importantly is what are you trying to accomplish with your security function is paramount. And the phrase that I've been using lately is you can't build a threat model without understanding the business model. And what Brian was talking about is exactly that, right? It goes exactly to that. You have to understand how your business works. And if you can't trace a dollar from order to all the way, from manufacturing or whatever you do, right? Whatever your business generating activities are, if you can't trace every dollar, and then you can't answer for every dollar of your own security spend and tell us exactly what you're getting, what is the ROI? And I'm not talking about rosy, I'm not talking about some weird, internal security development metric. I'm talking about in ways that matters to the business. If you don't know how the company makes money, then you can't protect that cash flow. I'll give you a quick example. I worked for a company years ago that I was advising, and we came up against an issue that was affecting not so much our revenues, but the speed, the cash flow velocity, right? So it was really not a matter of how many orders we were landing. It was how many orders we could actually execute on book and then report on a quarterly and annual basis on a 10Q and 10K, right? So once we understood that that was an issue, that this is what the CEO cared about, that's what the CFO cared about, that's what kept them up at night, right? Because when we came to them with security questionnaires, they would just throw it to somebody, delegate that, fill it out, and then come back and say, okay, put that on the risk register. When we flipped the question, framed it correctly, and we said, don't give me an answer that you think I want. Give me an answer that keeps you up at night. That's when we surface some of these issues. And then you map to that, right? So you gotta frame the problem correctly. And I think in cybersecurity, we spend an insignificant amount of time framing the problem, and we spend an ordinary amount of time trying to answer the problem with a quote unquote solution, which most of the time means technology. So that's the long answer, and the short answer to your question is, can you solve with technology? The answer is no. Products don't solve anything.
Hey, I want to just quickly answer a question that Laura popped up on here. So it's a great question, right? And I know my example was revenue streams, right, as like the identifier. That's just an example. But her question was government contractors have to comply with cybersecurity regulations, so they can't focus on the largest revenue stream. That is correct. And Mike, back me up here if I'm right or wrong. Complying with regulation is the door opener to that revenue stream, right? So
Absolutely right.
You kind of have to hit that as your first one, and then look at what that allows you. I mean, that's your hunting license. So great question, Laura. I think it's a nice turn on where to look at if you're in that sector.
Yeah, I faced a situation where we were potentially going to fail a government audit, which meant that the impact was going to be you wouldn't be able to bill the government directly. Every invoice you submitted would have to go through 6 months of reviews, which would take the days outstanding for getting paid way down the line. So that, the C-suite of the company is like, don't let that happen. So we had to pass the audit. So we had to put some controls in place to satisfy the government requirements. Being compliant with the government thing is not a goal in and of itself. If you say, well, we could just walk away from our government business, if you can afford to do that, you don't need to be compliant for the government. But if you want to be publicly traded, you need to be SOX compliant. If you want to work for the DoD, you have to comply with whichever standard they happen to use at the time so that you can generate revenue. But I've had clients who, 90% of the business is commercial, 10% is government, and they have to comply with a standard. And I said, well, you don't. You could just not, you could shave off 10% of your revenue. And they're like, no. So excellent question, but it goes back to the point, how do you make money? How do we help the business make money? That is the mission of the cyber team. And I like a point that was made by Brian and Igor a while ago. Information security team doesn't have a goal of its own. Its goal is to support the business. Just like the IT department, it doesn't stand alone and exist on its own. Its job is to make the business work more effectively. If the rest of the business went away, IT and cyber can't stand on their own. And well, this is the business, just the IT and cyber. You need the revenue generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks,
well, I'm going to take an opportunity if I can. Look, compliance came up, and we knew it was going to come up in the conversation eventually. I think a lot of us look at compliance as this kind of a mandatory thing. We got to do it. We got to comply with it. We have to, do the questionnaires. We have to send them out. And whether we're on the vendor side or the supplier side or the buyer side, we got to go through this, right? And it's this arduous process. It's very manual for a lot of us. And the idea really is if compliance can become an enabler in and of itself. If the function can be rethought, repositioned, reframed, re-architected, and really evolved to kind of that next gen compliance. And we're seeing the emergence of that. And of course, at Cumulus, we're doing that, but this is not a product plug by any means, but it's about vision and strategy. If your vision of compliance, if your understanding of compliance is just this another function that you have to do, and you throw money at it, you throw people at it, especially in DC, we know the ISO contingent, that's a big population, right? The information system security officers, they shuffle a lot of that paper. What is the actual value? Can we derive additional value out of that beyond just the revenue generation, right? Because if we're already doing the controls work, if we're pulling this data in, can we create some security understandings along that same data without having to do it twice, without having to have a separate security function and a compliance function? And I think a lot of folks are coming to that realization that there is no compliance data and security data. It's all just data. It's telemetry. It's information about your environment. So it's just a matter of how can you use it. And again, it goes to that vision, it goes to that strategy. If we consider functions as silos, then we go down that path. If we consider things holistically, if we look at things under the umbrella of risk, then you govern it differently, you deploy it differently, and you shift your resources differently, right? And it becomes a lot more adaptive and dynamic. I think that is a dimension that also needs to be measured, that today we're not measuring at that program level, at the enterprise scale. We're not thinking of convergence as a metric. We're not thinking of automation as a general metric. So I think that's something to evolve towards. So that's my spiel on that.
Cool. So go ahead, Brian.
No, I was gonna say I was kind of curious what Tony's take on the first question about, like, can we solve security with a product, or can we solve any of this with a product or a service? I was curious what your take was, Tony.
Well, that's an interesting one. Of course, I've worked for a company that sells security products, but I'm going to say no. I mean, I agree with everything that Igor and the rest of you said. You can buy every product out there in the market, but until you understand what it is that you're trying to solve, and that you've configured it in a way and have the right measurements in place to understand, is it even deployed to all of the places that it should be? Is it configured in a way for my environment to use it the most effective way? Is what it's telling me actionable, and is it getting to the right people and being responded to, right? So the tools, I feel as though, is more of an efficiency gain, right? I've said for a long time, technology just speeds things up. So if you've got a good process and you throw technology on it, then you get a fast, good process. And if you got a crappy process and you throw technology, then you have a fast, crappy process. It's just the way it goes. And so technology is, you can't do security really, really well without some investment in technology. But I'll say, unless you have that oversight, that governance, the configuration to meet your organization's requirements, the technology by itself isn't going to do you a lot of good.
I hope more people will, listen to this, because unfortunately, I feel that we're trying to sometimes solve too many issues with products. And products, like you said, are about efficiency. It's a vehicle. Eventually, you have to drive it. Do you know where you're heading? I think that is key. So I think that's a big, takeaway. Hopefully, that people will remember that you don't just deploy something, and you have to do that. That's why I love this type of webinars. Back to the basics, because it's about those things that we have to, if we have a good foundation, then the efficiency will work on making good things. Otherwise, like you said, something that if you're making efficient a bad process, then you're going the wrong direction, in full speed, which is maybe even worse than not doing anything. So, so I think,
this probably ties in well to, I think Shaquille asked kind of a good question, like, how do you report to the board all these very technical things? And since you have it up in the background, recently wrote a book on the NIST cybersecurity framework, available through just about anybody, I guess, but Wiley published it. The reason there for that book was the misunderstanding or lack of understanding of using a control framework. So, the biggest thing I see when I first talk to potential clients for SideChannel, they're like, oh, hey, we're thinking about buying this product, or I need to hire this guy or girl and do this thing. And it's like, what's your program based on? Like, why are you doing all this? Like, oh, well, just best practices. It's like, okay, well, explain to me what those are. And they can't. So, really basics. And I think hopefully this helps answer Shaquille's question. Like, what framework are you starting with? Okay. Select those controls that you say, look, this is what our organization will look good against. This is what our target state is going to be set against. Assess what you look like today. And then those gaps become your strategy to then meet your target state. Those are the controls, Shaquille. Those are the controls you should be answering to the board, because that's how they're going to understand it. Okay. They're not going to understand vulnerability scan data or how many switches you have. I think you asked a couple other questions about, like, password complexity length. The board doesn't care about that. They're going to roll their eyes and they're going to probably not invite you back to talk about that security in the future. I think we've all been there. You set a standard that you're going to align to. Assess yourself against that standard. Figure out what your strategic roadmap is to meet your target state, what you want to look like, and report on that. Report on those high-level controls. I picked NIST because I'm in the United States and tax dollars at work, and I had great insight into working on it when I was in the DoD, and it works really well for corporate America. If you're in Europe, use ISO. I don't care what it is, but pick a standard, stick with it, see it all the way through. So yeah, I think that's a great starting point. It's a phenomenal building block and foundation for the rest of your security program, because you can point back to, hey, we're building this based on NIST or ISO, whatever the standard is, not just because, right? And Tony and Igor and Michael and I, we've all been buyers as CISOs and professionals. We've all been buyers of products. And if we ever had a leg to stand on around what we were buying, why we were buying it, and tying it back to, the standard or a framework, it was a lot easier of a discussion than just, well, the sales guy took me out for a nice lunch and he kind of made me believe that that's the thing I need. It's like, that doesn't fly. So start with something foundational like a framework.
And the good news is, Igor, I think, mentioned, and Michael, you guys spoke to the need for compliance with regulations, et cetera. People may not realize that there's a lot more of an overlap between the frameworks and the objectives and the legal and regulatory requirements that you have. And there are mappings that are out there, and I will put a plug out there. Consortium has actually built this mapping in the framework for people to use. If you want to use it, let me know, or just go to the site. But the mappings are out there to use. You'll find that when you do the overlaps on the objectives, there's going to be very little difference on whether it's FFIEC or whether it's NYSDFS or whether it's your own framework for NIST or ISO. They're very similar in what it is that you're trying to achieve, or how you as an organization need to interpret that to apply to your business.
Quite right.
Here's another question.
Okay.
So how do you deploy it? I mean, so we all talked about risk, right? Where do you define it eventually? So you spoke to all the business owners. Now you want to communicate it to the organization. You want to basically deploy your strategy, and you want to make sure that risk is addressed. How do you communicate that to people? Where do people understand what is our risk tolerance as an organization? I don't know, Brian, you want to take this one?
Probability times impact, right? Like, what is the impact of that system? Like you said, Gabby, what's the 24 hours down on your organization? That's, you've determined an impact, right? You've come up with something that has an impact. What is the impact to that system? My example before, if it was a dollar value, right? Or if you're not compliant, you're going to have a massive impact, right? So determine what is the extent, the pain that is going to be caused by the bad thing happening, right? What's the probability of that actually happening? Now, probability is, traditionally people kind of just look at it as if there's nothing in between bad guy, right? And, I did it backwards, bad guy and good guy, right? There's nothing there. Probability is high. Well, as good guys, we put in, and somebody brought this up, defense in depth. So we're putting in things to keep bad people from doing bad things, or good people doing stupid things, right? Because sometimes that happens. Sometimes, and then, we're left ideally with all good people doing good things. So putting in controls, right? Either outright blocking and fully remediating vulnerabilities, or putting in mitigating controls to reduce, the likelihood of those of bad things happening. That all rolls into probability. You need to then factor that out to, okay, what is that risk? And again, not a lot of people like, red, yellow, green, high, medium, low. But if you're not doing anything else, start there before you're getting lost in like real math. Like, if I figured this out, I was like, okay, the risk of impact of something is pretty high to our organization. Probability of this thing is pretty high. This is my high risk. I've identified a high level risk. Okay, plot that, put that down. Do the numerical quant, math approach to all of this later. Just start putting down some basics. I think a lot of people get paralyzed and not do anything because they're looking for some perfect system here to calculate what to do. And if you just start with a whiteboard or a piece of paper and just start plotting these things down, you'll start getting a sense and a visual of what are you dealing with, right? So was it perfection is the enemy of progress, right? It's very, very true in our space. And a lot of professionals get too caught up in trying to figure out this perfect quantifiable math to then determine why you're going to do something. The reality is you just need to start doing something.
Look, it's a sliding scale, right? You can never, you can never be 100% secure no matter what they tell you ever. No product, no solution will give you that 100% secure. And unfortunately, we see some advertisements around that on the market. I hope people will say, will stop saying, 100% privacy and security. But also on the other hand, but how do you, so here's my question, so you define the risk, do you communicate that to the CEO and then hope the CEO will communicate it, downstream, or is this, talk a little bit about the communication between the different departments. How do we articulate what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, beyond only the controls that we implement? Because it's one thing to deploy controls that stop people from doing something, but is it important for the organization to understand what's acceptable risk, what is not acceptable risk? Do we tell people everything is a risk, don't do everything? Like, how do you communicate that?
So I'm a policy wonk. My colleagues tease me because I actually read policies, but I think it's imperative that you have an information security policy that people can read. And we've whittled it down. I got like a 3-pager that in normal human language says, we have some information that we have to treat differently. Sensitive information. This is in general how you categorize it. If you have questions, ask your manager. You have to tell people that we do things that require special treatment. And then an acceptable use policy, again, short and sweet, that says these are things that are okay, these are things that are not okay. One of the core sentences in an acceptable use policy, we know you're going to use company resources sometimes for personal use, but you can't let it interfere with work, whether it's how much time or how much bandwidth or the content of what you're putting out there. So you have to tell people that you have an information security program, what it's focused on, and then what you expect them to do about it. Because we talk about people, process, and technology as being part of information security. And people are the most important because you can put in all your defense in depth and all these products that are 100% perfect, and somebody is still going to wind up facing a phishing email in their inbox. And it's down to that user deciding whether or not to click on that thing and open it up and enter in their credentials that gets past all of your millions of dollars of investment. So the users have to know that they are part of information security. I was so disappointed once when a guy said to me, well, I thought security was your job. I was like, my job is to clean up when you don't do it right. But everybody's job is security. And you have to make sure that users understand that. And setting the policy is important because that is the roadmap that tells people this is what I expect. And then continuously educating them, not in a hostile way. It should be, we call it guardrails, not spike traps on the side of the road. If somebody starts going off the road, you want to bounce them back onto the road. You don't want to lose them. To keeping users involved and engaged so that if the technology fails, which it will, then the users know what they should do, whether that's stepping away from the keyboard and calling somebody in IT or clicking on report a phish button. Your staff at every level in every department have to be part of your information security. And when you wrote admins on the whiteboard earlier, staff admins, support admins, the people who help the CEO, the person who manages the CEO schedule, that person needs to be very well educated. They're the guard dog that keeps the bad guy from getting through to the CEO. You need those persons to be integral part of your information security program.
I totally agree. When you look at physical security, it's more obvious. There are signs, and people, understand, how to operate the machine without the certificate, maybe without training, they cannot even come close to that machine. In the physical world, I guess it's because the risk is more tangible. Then maybe, the policies are better articulated. I just feel in the cyber world, it's just everyone does whatever they want, and there's sort of like you said, and that's what drives me crazy, because that attitude of like, I'll do whatever I want, and it's your job to protect me so I don't do stupid things. Like, let's see you do that with a machine. You won't do that. Like, why in the cyber world do you think that's acceptable? Because what? It's virtual and not physical. It's go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, I was going to just add that cyber, I think, is a bit different. I think Brian mentioned cyber is not a risk. I think cyber is more of a hazard, right? A threat of sorts that goes across all business, all corporate risk issues. It's fraud, it's physical, it's operational risk, it's strategic risk, it's data and information risk, right? And I think if we can stop thinking of it as a silo as opposed to something that may have impact on all business risks and how it can influence that, how something can come in via email, a USB, a conversation that you can have can ultimately lead to some impact across some of these more traditional risk issues. And I think the more we think of it that way, I think the more kind of successful your security program can be. Because the other thing is it's always evolving, right? Nobody ever thought about business email compromise. And so, at FM Global, right, which is a big property insurer where it came from before Consortium, we dealt a lot in property risk, buildings burning, hurricanes, floods, etc. And I used to say Mother Nature is a threat actor, right? But she very rarely changes the ways that she's attacking you. She knows it's flood, and so therefore over a period of time you can trend it and you can put in capabilities to mitigate either the likelihood or the impact of some of those things happening. In cyber, it's like Mother Nature is always trying to find a way around the last thing that you did to prevent that impact, right? And so because it's so complex, it's so broad, and it's always evolving, I think, it's complex, and you can't really teach everyone how to be a cyber expert. So I think the more that you work with the executive leadership in defining their objectives, their risk tolerance and risk appetite levels, and then you as the CISO are responsible for figuring out how to embed the expectations into every role, into every practice, and work with the appropriate, staff teams to help them manage the risk that they encounter on a day-to-day basis. I feel that's going to lead to the most successful program.
Brian, I thought you wanted to say something as well.
No, I was just thinking about coming from insurance as well, seeing non-cybersecurity professionals look at cyber and try to figure it out. And the best that they can do that I have ever seen out of the actuarial and the underwriting teams were, it's a lot like earthquakes. We don't know when they're going to happen. We don't know the magnitude at which they're going to happen. We don't know exactly what they're going to do, but we know that earthquakes can happen. Now they can figure out kind of where they may be, but they still can't ever pinpoint it. Heck, I was in Virginia when one hit just south of DC back in the mid 2000s, and everyone was like, what was that? Like, no one was expecting that. We're not on a fault line. So yeah, and then I'm just also thinking about Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park when he's just like, nature finds a way. Like, you cannot dodge that. So yeah, if you look at what is possible, it's really human creativity is the limit, right? Bad guys and girls are doing this and are only limited by their own creativity. So us as professionals, if we can think about what are they doing, what are they capable of doing, what is the level of creativity that they have, I can start figuring out where are my risks now, what could be impacted, what is the probability of them doing that, what are the attack pathways. William's got a couple of great points on here. I think he's going like very technical on the the components that we're trying to talk about. Yes, there are pathways to into an organization. Can we figure out all of them? No, but we can try, again, based on human creativity. Again, I'm standing outside the castle and looking at it going, how would I get in? Versus just sitting inside the castle going, nobody can get in because I built all this stuff, right? Now I realize the moat and castle analogy, should totally die in the zero trust world. I owe somebody a $1 for saying zero trust, but really, when you can take the attacker's kind of viewpoint on yourself, you stand to be in a much better position to be able to then determine, what should I be protecting as well. So, I'm a big fan of both inside out and outside in as far as protecting an organization or an asset or people. You can't just sit in a defender's mindset and position and just expect, yeah, this is going to work out totally in my favor. So,
Are there
I-
okay, go ahead, Michael.
Just two quick points. There's one is you can't defend against everything. I mean, I worked in one of the big defense contractors, and I had a massive team and a huge budget, great people and technology. We were under attack all the time, so there was inevitable that somebody was going to get in, and that was one of the best resourced organizations for fighting cyber in the world. So you have to have an instant response plan, or at least think about how you're going to respond when something bad happens, because bad things happen to even the biggest companies with the biggest budgets. So that's one. And the other is going back to making sure users are aware. If a user could just be a little bit cautious, if something weird happens that we have never seen before, the user can at least go, I don't know what this is, but I should call Igor because I don't know what this is. And maybe maybe it's a cyber thing. Maybe I just hit the wrong button. But you get the user to just be sensitive to realize that if something weird's happening, they should call somebody, not ignore it or just keep banging away at the keyboard.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We're going to have a webinar about that as well, because I think communication and, and training and communication is a key part, because we want to give people, the comfort of coming to us. And, I can go on that, and how to build that trust with, and how to show the team that they have a personal benefit from, learning about cybersecurity, because it goes beyond the company, right? It goes, it goes home, right, into their families and kids, and so that's a whole new topic. But I think it's a key thing in building, the security practice. So I wanted to ask before that, how do I know that I've chosen right? So we do this risk assessment. So maybe I was totally off. How do I know if I did a good risk assessment? And how do I measure it? And how often do I do it again? We have about 12 more minutes. I hope we can. This is the big question. I hope I would have asked.
I'll say
I'll give you a
this.
very quick answer.
Oh, okay, good. Go to Igor.
I'll give you a 30-second answer. How do you know your program works? You test it. You test it continuously. You don't do it on a cadence of monthly, quarterly, annually, even daily. You do it all the time. You automate to the degree possible. You minimize the reliance on manual cycles to pull the information in and analyze it. You rely on telemetry as much as possible. I don't care if you have a legacy system that's 4 years old. There's some data that you can pull from, and if you can't do it directly, do it indirectly by proxy. Collect telemetry, pull it together, figure out what the analytics say, and then deploy your resources accordingly. And then you test all of that holistically. And I don't mean run a vuln scan that runs all the time in the background. It's not about that. You test it the way a bad guy would, right? You simulate attacks, you emulate attacks, whatever decision you make, with that kind of an approach. But you test your program, not systems, not just your tool set. You test your program, and you figure out very quickly, based on those scans and tests and realistic pen tests, what is the risk mitigation value of every piece of technology that you have. And that's how you answer for that spend, right? Where I talked about earlier and what Brian mentioned, these systems are built insecurely. We've built the internet, we've built these systems, we've built these products and software insecurely, unfortunately, right? We're trying to evolve to zero trust. That's a great objective, and everybody should embrace that. And we're seeing a lot of stuff emanating from DC now, CISA, publishing the frameworks. It's great, right? But until we get there, you got to know where you stand. And the only way to know where you stand is to get there ahead of the threat. So try to execute inside the attacker's OODA loops, be the attacker, impersonate the attacker with the most fidelity that you can, and then make decisions based on that. I'll leave it
I
there.
think something that you said, which is important, also around, for example, pen testing. I think, instead of just doing pen testing, like that goes back to risk. Do the pen testers know what you are testing for? Because just testing without understanding what you're testing, and I see that sometimes where they just run a pen test, like scan, here are things, like, no, we defined what we want to test. This is our risk. Can we test that first? I think, and when everybody is on board on what is risk, then everything works more streamlined and smooth because we know what we're testing. Anyone else wants to add on to this?
My biggest thing is governance. Just like if you can establish a basic governance structure that forces you to reevaluate your controls, your security posture, whatever it is that's underneath your purview on a regular basis, you just need to keep doing it once a year and then expecting that, all the projects that happened, made you better and then checking it out a year later, it's never going to work. You're never going to make the progress. And I think we're in a position now where we can start doing these assessments much easier and in bite size. Again, they don't have to be everything. Just take, if you have 100 controls inside of your organization you want to align to, right? Do your first assessment against those 100, and then every quarter pick 5 or 10 or 20, and every quarter you just look at those, right? And rotate through. But again, just keep making incremental, reviews and improvements on what you're doing. But put it down, govern it, document it, and just repeat. And I think you'll find you're going to save yourself a lot of time and headache later on by doing that sort of, exercise and just building that kind of muscle memory.
I think that's key. The fact that you don't, I think that's what scares a lot of people. They see this plan and, especially for small businesses, and, they're just turned off when they see the list. And that's really hard also for bigger organizations. Everybody's lacking budget, so like when you see a huge list, so knowing that you can start small and prioritize and just make progress all the time, just make sure you're having progress, I think is key here. Michael, Tony, do you have anything to add on this?
I think just going back a little bit about what Brian said about defining good for your organization, use the framework as a baseline, and then measure your program through tools that exist or whatever to validate that you've implemented the things in accordance with good practice, that they documented, and then providing that oversight, measuring its effectiveness and how well you've applied it and implemented it across the organization. I think unless you do that, things have a tendency to, drift over a period of time because of other priorities, et cetera. So unless you've got your finger on the pulse, what was good yesterday may not be good tomorrow.
Do you guys also think it's to document also what risk we are accepting? Because we're always talking about like mitigating risk. What about communicating to the organization like, okay, we're not going to invest in this, for example. We don't want anything bad to happen. So like, how do you deal with the things that we do accept?
Yeah,
I think it's an important part of getting security to be trusted by the organization. So, for instance, if you have a policy that says you can't do X, but then there's some overwhelming business need to do X, the team that's trying to do that thing should talk to security, make sure security understands what they're trying to accomplish, and that whatever other additional controls might be in place, but to help the business do X, but you should also document. We normally don't do this thing, but there's a real good reason for doing it. We're going to write it down. Yes, we decided we're going to do X on this date. These people said, yes, okay. And again, it's not my job as a CISO to approve it. It's the business's job to approve taking risks. I'll stop there.
I'll give you 3 letters. RAL, risk acceptance letter. That's it. That is the governance mechanism for risk acceptance. Now, with a caution, that comes with a caveat, because I have seen those used, kind of become a vehicle for putting things off book, right? Basically, you execute a RAL and then you kind of forget about the risk. We've accepted it and it goes away, right? And nobody's quantifying it. And there is no cadence for checking back and making sure that, we've actually mitigated it. So that can be dangerous. but that is kind of the commonly accepted method of doing it. And then everybody gets on the same page, everybody's signatures go on the same on that same piece of paper. You make it concise, you make it clear, you make it transparent. That's part of the governance model. Now, again, you have to wrap the right processes around it. There has to be ethics around it, and it helps when there are more than one unit or one department as part of that loop, right? So, you know, if you have an inspector general function, maybe they should be in the loop. If you have a corporate counsel, they should be in the loop, right? So get folks outside of security, outside of the risk management function to acknowledge it, because you want as many eyes on this as possible to make sure that it gets closed.
So what do
And
you
then come
do?
back to it.
What do you do, for example, when you have someone that, you know, senior manager comes in, calls the IT guy or someone and says, hey, I need to connect from home. Can you please open this up? And like, how do you manage risk when senior management starts accepting risk that we never agreed on? Like, how do you manage that? And they say, look, you know, you should have put controls in place, or I didn't know. Like, what do you do with that?
I think you need to
Send them a
assess
copy
the
of the
risk to
animal
the
farm.
organization.
Go ahead.
Go ahead,
So I was going to say you need to understand the risk to the organization. Just because they're a senior manager, they may not be authorized for the risk that they're trying to accept, right? We used to run into this all the time. You know, a system or an application owner wanted to accept risk, let's say for engineering. To me, I would say engineering needs to accept the risk, not the application owner that wants to accept that, because that makes it easy for them. And so that would force a dialogue between the senior leaders. And so I would say if a senior leader wants to open a number of firewall ports to make it easier for them, I would say you know, what's the least common denominator of the risk they're introducing? And if that happens to be all lines of business, then guess what? You're probably going to go to the top of the house for that approval.
Gotcha.
Right. With the recommendation, by the way, I think one thing that we've been missing is, oh, bring it to the business leaders, bring it to the executives, et cetera. I feel as though it is the role of the CISO or the security team to come to them, you know, explain the risk, but also a recommendation of what you believe to be the response or the answer, because I think they're going to look to you for that guidance and that consultancy.
Yeah, we've got about 2 minutes left, and maybe we just kind of wrap up. But to Tony's point and Michael's point, I think the CISO, the security professionals inside the organizations, we need to start acting more like outside counsel, and we need to start being looked at like outside counsel. We are there to guide an organization, give the recommendations based on our experience, our subject matter expertise of what to do, what is best, what are your decisions, what are your options, what is the weight of each of those options for the organization. The more we can operate in that kind of a capacity, the stronger the business is going to be, the more we're going to actually be involved, and the less we're going to be looked at. And Igor started out this whole conversation with the part that I love. We are no longer just this shop of no and this gatekeeper. We really need to be, you know, lead consultants and subject matter expertise to be able to lay out what does this mean if you choose to do this thing or not do this thing to the organization from a cybersecurity risk standpoint. So go lawyers.
Brian, do you want to maybe say a little bit about side channels? I don't think you talked a lot about it when just to
Thanks.
before we're wrapping up.
Sure. Yeah, it's and I appreciate Tony and Igor both being on here, and I think we're actually pseudo competitive in what we're doing. But obviously, the community that we have as security professionals, I think it speaks volumes that, you know, we as professionals can come together, even though we might be competitors. We're all trying to do and kind of all march towards the same thing. Obviously, I respect both of them and Michael for their expertise and joining this. But yeah, I mean, you know, I'm happy to be co-sponsoring this with you, Gabby and Wiser. You know, we're just looking at the mid-market and small businesses and trying to help them with anything that they can around cybersecurity and privacy initiatives. So, you know, looking forward to the rest of the series. I think we've got a great lineup over the next 10 or 9 after this, which will bring us all the way through March. We've got some great guests, some other great panelists. And if anybody's out there, if you know, we'll be posting on social what those are. If you are an expert and you want to sit in the seat here with myself and Gabby to talk about these things, and you feel that passionate about that part of the topic, please reach out to me. Hit us up on LinkedIn. You can follow anything that we have on #CISOLife. Obviously, you can reach out to Gabby or myself on through our pages. And yeah, let's bring some other panelists on and have some further great discussions. So I think this has been great, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of them. So hopefully everyone did too. It's the top of the hour, 1 o'clock on the East Coast. So Igor, Tony, Mike, thanks so much for being on. Enjoy your days. Gabby, thanks for kicking all of this off and starting out this, bringing the Back to the Basics webinar series back.
Awesome, guys. Thank you very much. Until next time, I think
Thanks for having us on.
about
Enjoy it.
backup, which is a great topic as well. So we're going to talk about that next in the next webinar. So thank you once again. Until next time, bye and take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. All right.